Lecture series, Visions and Voices, Writers on Conservation, Wildness, and Nature. This series is co-sponsored by the Wilderness Institute and the University of Montana Environmental Studies Program. Our speaker tonight, Gary Ferguson, will be talking for about 40-45 minutes, and we'll have question, answer, and discussion. And then after the question and answer session, Gary will be signing books just outside this door. And so if you'd like to purchase a book or talk with Gary about anything that wasn't covered in the Q&A, you're welcome to find him right up there. And now I'd like to welcome Bill Condon, Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies. Bill is our co-organizer, a representative from the Environmental Studies program here, and is the co-organizer for this series. And he'll be introducing Gary Ferguson tonight. So welcome, Bill.
I'm just holding, whoa. I'm getting the bugs out here for Gary. I'm just holding this, and I'm going to turn it over in just a minute. It's my pleasure to introduce Gary Ferguson tonight. He's written for dozens of national publications, including Vanity Fair, the LA Times, Outside Magazine, and he's also the author of 16 books on nature and science. His most recent title, Decade of the Wolf, with biologist Douglas Smith, was chosen as the 2006 Montana Book of the Year. Hawk's Rest, A Season in the Remote Heart of Yellowstone, was the first nonfiction book to win both the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association and the Mountain and Plains Booksellers Association annual award for nonfiction. Gary was the 2002 Siegel Scholar at Washington University in St. Louis, and he's currently teaching here at UM as the Kittredge Distinguished Visiting Writer in the Environmental Studies program. He's a regular presenter on nature and ecology issues and has appeared on more than 200 television and radio programs, so he'll be able to figure this out, in cities around the nation, and his nature-oriented essays can be heard on National Public Radio affiliates around the country also. Gary's originally from Indiana, and I think I can hear a Midwestern ground root sensibility when I read his work. But for well over the last 2 decades, maybe closer to 3, he's lived in Red Lodge, Montana, at the foot of the Beartooth Mountains. And to my mind, his voice is one of the strongest voices that's emerged from and is speaking for the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and all the wild life and water and rock that encompasses. So please join me in welcoming my friend, my colleague, and the Kittredge Distinguished Visiting Writer in Environmental Studies, Gary Ferguson. Great to have you. Oh.
I could just talk like this.
Yeah, I'll stand there.
We'd make a good team, Phil. Oh, thank you. That was a very kind introduction, and I'm thrilled to be with you. Thrilled to be in Missoula, as a matter of fact. The big city. We don't even have a stoplight yet in Red Lodge, so this is the thing that I have worried about, though, is everybody's so nice. Whenever you step off the curb anywhere, they stop here, and I know I'm going to take that with me somewhere where that isn't the practice, and it's going to have terrible consequences. So I'm going to have to be deprogrammed before I leave in the spring. I thought I would start out with just a little bit of background about what I'm going to talk about this evening. I've always, as a nature writer, been very interested in the concept of nature and landscape being able to actually shape human perception in a big way. This is something the ancient Greeks talked about, and it was probably common knowledge, of course, long before that. But in our own country, there are kind of practical examples of it, if you will. Willa Cather used to talk often about how her neighbors in the open spaces of the Dakotas were inclined to see the world very much as it is. They were no nonsense, and she equated that open space as being a kind of a revelatory process on them so that they weren't inclined to nonsense or playing games or not letting you know exactly what you think. She thought because of the landscape in a big way, they were actually more to the point than other people living in other kinds of environments. And I saw that kind of thing on a very practical level too years ago when I wrote a book called Shouting at the Sky, which allowed me to spend 3 months in a very compassionate, therapeutic-driven wilderness therapy program, not a boot camp. This was a very successful therapy program down in southern Utah, and I was struck the first couple of weeks I was there. I was going through instructor training just to kind of see what that was about, and we visited a group, and the instructors had decided, as they often did, that one of the girls in this particular group was really having a hard time kind of letting go of her games. These were kids, 14 to 17-year-olds, who were, a lot of them addicted to drugs and getting in all kinds of trouble. And, you know, they often spent the first week or two playing games about, you know, I don't have any problems and I don't know why I'm here. And what they did was they took her out of the forested environment for a day or two in the desert at the foot of Capitol Reef National Park. And like had happened, they told me, to so many other kids, she just opened up. She got very real in that open, vulnerable, exposed landscape. And it was a really profound example to me of this kind of notion of landscape influencing behavior. As Lawrence Durrell said, we are the children of our landscape. It influences behavior and even thought to the extent that we're receptive to it. And in her case, she wasn't necessarily receptive to it, but it worked nonetheless. And then besides this practical level of landscape influencing us, there's a great, wonderful, long history we're going to spend a lot of our time tonight on, and that's kind of the imaginative effect of landscape on a culture, on individuals. It's interesting, if you look at the symbology of indigenous cultures around the world, those who shared, say, forest environments as their primary home turf, if you will, tended to come up with the same kinds of symbology in their cosmology and their religion as other forest-dwelling cultures that they were not connected to in other parts of the world. And I'm not just talking about using trees as sacred symbols. I'm talking about the texture, the geometry of the way they saw God or the gods and their relationship to cosmology was shaped very much. Same with desert cultures. Very similar cosmology erupting among various desert cultures who never had any relationship with each other. You get people like Henry George, who was a best-selling author in the 1800s, saying, you know, it doesn't really matter if anybody ever goes out to these places like Yellowstone or Glacier. Well, Glacier wasn't created yet, but some of the forest reserves were being created at the time he said this. He said it doesn't matter if you ever go out there or not. It just knowing they're there will engender what he said, a consciousness of freedom in Americans. And so again, there's a symbolic influence that landscapes have as well. And I decided that I would love to tell the story of a landscape that really did that for America. You could have picked a lot of landscapes. Nature in general has informed America, as I hope to share with you in a big, big way, and many of you are already well aware of this. But the Rockies are the landscape that I chose, and I chose the Rockies for, well, on one hand, to be honest, because I just love this landscape. I've loved it for since I was 9 years old in Indiana. As Phil suggested, I told my parents I was going to move out west to the Rockies, and did everything I could to get there, including mowing lawns and shoveling snow when I was 12 and 13, with this great plan of funding a trip to ride my bike out to Colorado, my Purple Stingray 24-inch bike with a banana seat. And my parents, when they realized I was actually accumulating money for this, had to sit down and tell me that that wasn't going to happen. But nonetheless, it's been a landscape that's just driven me for a long, long time. And the Rockies have had some unique aspects to that influencing the culture ramble that I was on earlier. For one thing, they've been a really classic landscape, and I think almost an archetypal landscape for those people who don't fit in, who didn't fit in elsewhere in the culture. They tended to come to the Rockies. You had an amazing number of black men who had either escaped slavery in the South or bought their freedom beginning in the early 1830s and came out west to become trappers. And some of them had remarkable levels of success. They were accepted much more by the other trappers who were out here. They were certainly accepted by the Native Americans, to the point that by the end of the trapping era, a lot of Native tribes would not deal with anybody except a black trapper because they no longer trusted the Anglos. East of here, Edward rose from a slave in South Carolina, rose to the position of what would be almost like a co-chief with the Crow tribe. Whenever he would walk into camp, the children would raise their hands to the sky, which is a great sign of honor in that culture. He was in charge or co-charge of deciding what would go on and not go on as far as hunting on some 7,000 square miles of land. Black Harris was the guy who they went to when it was time to take the first 2 Anglo women across the Rocky Mountains on their way to the Walla Walla Valley for mission work. They figured that Black Harris was actually the most skilled, knowledgeable, trustworthy guy that they could come up with, and that's not a set of passengers they wanted anything to happen to. In fact, on Black Harris's tombstone it says, "And for the promise of equal rights, he climbed the snowy mountain heights." And then I always like to point out that after that, and this is why everybody needs an editor, whoever wrote the tombstone, the last little couplet said, "And he was a free and easy kind of soul, especially with a belly full." And it was like, wow, he just had this great high little minded notion, and then they just brought it right down. So that's the kind of stuff we're working on in the writing class as of late. And then women were also the daughters of wealthy women who were really chomping at the bit against the kind of social mores left over from the Victorian era back in New York and Baltimore and so forth. And we'll talk more about that. They found, believe it or not, great freedom in the dude ranches, as we'll see, of the West. And it was such a profound difference that a lot of people don't know it, but Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton made a big call in 1869 after Wyoming Territory passed suffrage for women, 50 years before the states of the United States gave women the right to vote, that she called for a mass migration to Wyoming Territory, tried to get thousands of women to go out. It really didn't amount to much, but women have a history of coming out here because they felt a certain freedom that they didn't feel elsewhere. And then finally there were the black sheep of wealthy industrialists who really just didn't want to follow in Dad's footsteps, who had big trouble with devoting their life to the accumulation of wealth to the point that they would come out, as we'll see, and become trappers or become remittance men, they call them, and they would use whatever family money they had to just stay out here in the Rockies, some of them turning their back on $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 estates that were left to them because they just didn't want to leave this place. So it's got a very interesting history on that practical level. And then it's got a history of influencing us on an imaginative level too, especially when it came time to think about alternatives to what was considered excessive capitalism, concentration of wealth in the 1890s when the robber barons were really going strong. The Rockies and the West in general were giving rise to things like the cowboy mythology. I mean, it wasn't the cowboys out here who came up with the cowboy myth. It was the Easterners who suddenly had gone from working on farms and being, relatively in control of their own lives in that respect to working in factories. Their children, 20% of the children from ages 9 to 13 in the early 1900s were working in mills and factories for 14 and 15 hours a day. They're the ones who loved the thought of some guy out on a horse roaming the open range making his own decisions. Of course, it's a little bit more complicated for cowboys than that, but they're the ones who wanted that mythology, and the Rocky Mountains supplied it in spades. Frederick Remington made an interesting comment once. He said that the real value of a place like the Rocky Mountains is to remind us of the world that exists beyond tasseled loafers, derby hats, and mortgages bearing 8%. And so even the wealthy were coming out here, spending 4, 5, 6 weeks, going on sometimes 3, 4 week long pack trips. Yeah, they were being waited on, but they were looking to get on the ground in the Rocky Mountains as an alternative to what they thought is excess and the softening, as Roosevelt would have said, influences of civilization. And finally, there was G. Stanley Hall, who was basically the founder of adolescent psychology, and he said, and this was in about 1906, he said this. He said, in this hothouse culture where everything ripens before its time, 2 things are needed for a child's education. One is nature and the other is story. And a lot of those stories and a lot of the books like Ernest Thompson Seton's adventure books were set in the Rocky Mountains. So a lot of kids who never set foot here had a sense, as I did in the corn and rust of northern Indiana, that the Rockies was some place that could allow us to fly our imaginations in a way that we weren't used to. I want to go way, way back before we get into the images and give you a sense of why, in America especially, I'm going to make the claim, there is a unique relationship with the natural world of all the Western countries in the world. And you could say, well, it's just simply that we had all this open country and we hadn't been, a civilization long enough to eat it up. And there's some truth to that, but there are some other things that were going on too. Starting in about the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries of AD, there arose in the Catholic Church kind of a more narrow vision of the earth and nature and what its value was. It's interesting to note that even the ancient Greeks had this notion that eventually the earth would basically wind down and degrade and disintegrate, and just like a person becomes old and falls apart, the Greeks thought the earth would as well. And when Christianity first came along, there was a widely held belief among the early Christians that just as humans were saved, and therefore would have immortality by belief in Christ, so would the earth be saved as well. And that was a predominant view among a lot of Christians for 200 and 300 years. That did start to erode, as I suggested, though, and it was eventually overwhelmed by this notion that we're maybe more used to associating with that early phase of Christianity, and that's the notion that the flesh and the earth, and certainly wilds, are something we just need to get through in order to get our way to heaven. And the emerging mythology, one of the stories that started to be told fairly often in around 450 AD, was that the earth was on creation what was called a mundane egg. That was paradise. When Adam and Eve were running around, it was a mundane egg. Doesn't sound real appealing, but that was the vision of paradise as the Catholic Church perceived it at that time. No wrinkles, no bumps, nothing out of place, perfect symmetry. And then what happened? Humans sinned. And when humans sinned, the floodwaters came. Of course, Noah built the ark rose, the floodwaters came, and then when the floodwaters receded, for the very first time, there were unkempt landscapes on Earth for the very first time. Mountains being primary among them, but irregular coastlines, all kinds of things. Even forests that were tangled, jungles, anything that didn't have perfect symmetry to it was put there, the church decided, to remind us as humans that we are basically evil. So if you read through a lot of the literature from 400 or 500 AD, clear through the 1500s, and to some extent beyond, you'll almost never see things like mountains referred to as anything but blisters, tumors, carbuncles, warts, all kinds of things that really tried to drive home the point that when you look out and you see something that isn't symmetrical, it's to remind you, courtesy of God, that you are an evil person. Well, that's a lot of weight to put on landscape. It's just, and people eventually, as you might imagine, just can't take that anymore. It's kind of hard to say what led to the breakdown of that and the Romantic Revolution and some of what you've no doubt already read about. But I think for one thing, science came along. Galileo had an opportunity to point his telescope to the moon and see mountains on the moon, for one thing. Points it up there, and the pundits start saying, well, why would God put mountains on the moon to remind us that we're evil when nobody can even see them with the unaided eye? That doesn't make any sense. And then as geology started getting rolling, there was a general breakdown. Also, I think there was a movement of art from the east, the Far East, into the Western civilizations. And the Asian cultures never had the need to turn nature into a Stephen King novel. It just, they never went there. So a lot of their understanding of nature and its role in spirituality started leaking across those borders in a way that they hadn't before. And it exploded. The interest in nature really started to explode. So now these colonists start coming over, and these explorers and trappers and traders to the New World in the early 1600s I'm talking about. And a lot of them, especially the French traders and trappers, the Puritans absolutely saw the devil behind every tree. There was no question about it. But these other people who weren't Puritans had a very different view. They seemed to just, their imaginations exploded when they came to those big forests and those mountains of the what's now the northeastern United States and southeast Canada. They were infatuated with what they saw. They sat down with a lot of the native tribes and they traded images, nature story images. This is when you start to see the word puck show up on the other side of the Atlantic and Shakespeare is the one who has the fame for using it as a kind of a vanishing sprite. Well, there's some thought now that that word is actually a shortened version of Pukwaji, which was an Iroquois word which means little vanishers. So they had all these stories that the Indians were telling the Anglos were telling the Indians. You start to see Indian stories show up with romantic elements, which they never had before. As time went on, we're spending, of course, a lot of time trying to, tame nature and build civilization. There's no question about it. But we're also simply spending a lot of time, both with the Native Americans and rubbing elbows with the woods. And the fact is, there's an old saying that you can't invade a culture, and I would expand it to say you can't invade a culture or a landscape without being invaded back. And so that invasion, that time spent in that semi-wild country for that long, that many generations, really had an effect. By the time the Declaration of Independence is signed, we have writers saying that we are going to be one of the most successful nations on earth because we've spent so much time in the woods. Abigail Van Buren said, we will create more artists, more musicians, writers, painters of all kinds, simply because we're spending so much time rubbing elbows with the forest. Lewis and Clark come through here 200 years ago. At the time they were on their way to the Pacific, there was a wonderful discussion, debate going on in New England among almost all the clergy, progressive or orthodox, and the question they were trying to settle was this: is nature the hand and voice of God, or is nature God himself? Now that sounds like something that would have come out of the 60s or the 70s, maybe the 80s via Shirley MacLaine. But it doesn't sound like it would have been a principal, fundamental aspect of what was being discussed among theologians in New England, but it was. For a long time, 130, 40 years, religion, nature, and patriotism were the three legs of the stool that pundits referred to that would make us who we are and to allow us to be around as long as we thought we would be as a great nation. So it's a very different kind of view of the natural world than perhaps you've heard before. With that in mind, should I turn the lights down a little bit? Or thank you, Lori. I wanted to just focus the rest of my time on some images, just a dozen or so, that might help make some of what I've said come into clearer focus. This is a picture called Westward, the Course of Empire, 1861, by a guy named Lutz, Manuel Gottlieb Lutz. And this was the story image I was trying to get beneath. This is the official Western version that I grew up with as a kid. Thankfully, in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been an explosion of other kinds of Western writing, from Patricia Limerick on and on and on, that have given other voices their due. But when I was a kid, this was pretty much it. Westward, the Course of Empire. You've got this wonderful shot here of this, let's see. Here's the kind of the Daniel Boone figure, and I know it's hard to see on this screen, but there are a couple women who have that kind of Madonna face with the little children on the wagon, and they're at the crest of the continent, on the Continental Divide, and they're looking toward the west, and the west is just fairly ill-defined, but it's golden, and it's beautiful, and it's the promised land, and all is well. Now this notion of manifest destiny, if you will, which is what this was meant to illustrate, was not anything new. Even in the late 1700s, there was a notion that, maybe one day we should, be a country that will stretch from sea to sea. But beginning in the 1830s and the 1840s and 50s, that manifest destiny became co-opted, if you will, by some very powerful politicians and investors and developers. And if you want to take control of a culture, the first thing you have to do is co-opt the mythology. That's always been true, and I think it always will be true. It's true today, and it was true back then. And so, despite all of this very impressive notion about nature and how powerful it was as a force to shape our character, there was some strong effort to paint the Rockies not as this benevolent kind of paradise out there somewhere, but as a dangerous hideout for heathens. I want to mention one other thing about how important it was for us to equate some of our principal values as a people, as Americans, to nature, and that has to do with the notion of freedom and equality in democracy. One thing everybody seemed to agree with at the signing of the Declaration of Independence is that we didn't want to be another landed gentry system. We didn't want to have a class system. And throughout the 1700s, nature was often referred to as the great equalizer. And that really basically means that well, as you can imagine, if we all this summer go into Glacier and we're stomping around in the willow bottoms and we spook up a sow grizzly with cubs, she's not going to care which of us has the most money in our bank account or who's got the best relationships as far as the blue in our blood. She's just going to react however, and whoever gets it, gets it. And they understood that nature delivers both its promise and its wealth and its riches, as well as its shadow and its potential for death equally. And this is why you see people so hungry to use nature, as we'll see in a little bit here, as a notion for democratic equality. I mean, clear up in 1950, you had Gerard Peel, the editor of Scientific American, saying, the real value of having a wilderness preserve is to remind us of the promise of a just society. That's what he's talking about. That doesn't even make sense anymore without understanding that history. But just society being suggested by the fact that out on the open landscape, we're all equal. And it was an important aspect to understand about our history. So here comes the Rockies and Manifest Destiny, and in the 30s, 40s, 50s, there start to be some rumblings by some very powerful men saying, you know, the Rockies, I wouldn't give $5 for one of the senators said from South Carolina for the whole range, and starting to describe it as a terrible ordeal, keeping our settlers from making their way to the Pacific. That's not what I found when I was going through settlers' journals and diaries at Harvard and Yale and Huntington and University of Wyoming. I was hard-pressed to find anybody who was absolutely terrified by the landscape. Did they have terrible difficulties and ordeals to go through? Absolutely they did. But most of them spent their time talking about how sublime the land was. Sublime being kind of that mix of awe and beauty, powerful beauty, almost overpowering beauty. The kind of beauty that Thomas Jefferson used to talk about a lot in Virginia. That's what attended most of their visions. The other thing is, though, if you start making a landscape kind of evil and terrible and something to conquer, it's a way to really rally support around you. And the other thing that these particular powerful men did was they started to associate this landscape, especially the people living there and out on the plains, as being heathens and being devils in a way that really was over the top. And that means, of course, kind of turning your back on a lot of fairly critical pieces of information about the Native American cultures, who, of course, were very mistreated in the East, and a lot of them died because of diseases that were introduced. But, you know, Ben Franklin was one who acknowledged the Iroquois in his understanding of political possibilities. Some historians think that he based his rough draft of federalism on the Iroquois Confederacy. They had referendums, recall procedures, suffrage, a lot of things that we wouldn't get for a long time. One of his contemporaries said the Iroquois outdid the Romans. So we had to ignore that. We had to ignore a lot of the writing that was going on. From 1775, at least all the way to 1925, there were probably 7,000 English language pieces of writing that were going on from Native Americans that have been absolutely ignored. I don't know about you, but I haven't, until I got out of school, I hadn't read a single one of them. So it took a lot to further this notion that we've got to get to the West Coast because we're doing it for God's glory and we're conquering the devil and the devil's ways. And that was how that Manifest Destiny for 30 years was sold, and it's a very common technique. You get control of mythology if you want to be a conqueror, for all you future conquerors out there. And the other thing you want to do is you want to put evil front and center as an obstacle to where you're trying to go and what you're trying to achieve. And
Familiar.
Yes, does that sound vaguely familiar? Yes, it certainly does. Yes, I thought somebody might catch that connection. But it's a tried and true practice. And I wanted to go beyond the Manifest Destiny story to something a little bit different. Oh, there we go. This is a photo that a painting that Alfred Jacob Miller painted, and it was absolutely stunning and much appreciated by most of the average folks who saw it when it went on tour back east in Philadelphia and Baltimore and New York. People would line up 200, 300 deep to get a look at this painting. It's a trapper actually marrying a Plains Indian woman, as was the custom of the day in her people's camp. This was very commonly done. The trappers who came out were very often marrying native women. And for the average person who saw the painting, and many of the critics who judged it and wrote about it in the New York Times and elsewhere, they just thought it was great. It was just some kind of embodiment of freedom and adventure. But the guys who were trying to do this is evil land, and the natives who live there are savages and devils, they went crazy against this kind of thing, because this was, basically marrying the devil as far as they were concerned. So again, you have these parallel tracks going on as far as what the common person was thinking about it and what those who wanted to get something out of the wealth of the West were saying about it. It's interesting too, as an aside, when you look at these kinds of paintings, the trappers were a little different than the old movies have suggested they were. They typically traveled in brigands of 20 to 40 people. 30 to 40% traveled with their families. They had wives and children. The reason they traveled with so many people was safety for one reason, but also some people could go and do the trapping, some could skin out the hide, some could take care of the equipment, some could strike camp, some could cook, all of those kinds of things. They held their profits usually communally. They were not uneducated for the most part. They had a similar rate of literacy as the country as a whole. Those who did speak more than one language spoke many, many languages. A lot of these guys, the black sheep, wealthy sons of the industrialists, they spoke Latin, they spoke French, they spoke Spanish, and they spoke a dozen or more native dialects as well. Some of them, if you read their diaries, it's fascinating. James Kleiman was writing about speculations about the speed of light. Rufus Sage came up with this great theory that the Romans had actually come over to the Great Plains long, long ago, probably 1,000 years ago, he said, and his proof was he compared a list of Latin words, about 30 Latin words, with about 30 Sioux words, and found them to be almost identical in meaning and pronunciation. And he said the only way that could have happened is if the Romans came over here. So these guys were, sitting around winter camp, reading, speculating. They had Shakespeare with them a lot of times, so it wasn't quite the bunch of hooligans and ruffians, although there were those too, that we've come to think of them as. This is perhaps the most famous landscape painting in the 19th century anyway, I would say, and it's from the 1830s, and it's called The Oxbow by Thomas Cole, one of the Hudson River School artists. Now, the Hudson River School artists were the first to really make into art that notion that I was talking about earlier, where nature is equivalent and wilderness to democracy. The Hudson River School exploded and perhaps is to this day the most significant landscape art movement this country has ever seen. And what they were often doing is celebrating all this unkempt nature. Before that, and right through it, the European art critics and the big city art critics were ridiculing landscape painters in America because they believed in something called the doctrine of associations. And the doctrine of associations means that if you're going to paint a landscape, if it doesn't have some sense of antiquity, leftovers from the human cultures that have been there before, whether it's a stone wall from the Roman days or an old cathedral or whatever, then it's worthless. It has no value if it doesn't have a human sign in it. And the Hudson River School artists said, what, are you nuts? We don't need any human signs. We've got the only thing we need, and that's nature, and that's a direct pipeline to God. As basically Thomas Cole and many others said, these guys considered themselves preachers, really taking from nature, putting on a canvas symbols that would help us divine the characteristics of God that are around us in nature. And they made a darn good living doing it. In this painting, Cole has, called the Oxbow, Cole has the one half of it as wilderness here. And then as you move across the Connecticut River, and this is Mount Holyoke, this is a real place, but he's exaggerated several things. As you move across the river, this forms a very exaggerated oxbow into a question mark. Over on this side, you've got people clearing the land and making it into a pastoral agricultural economy. Cole was basically asking, what really happens when all the land goes from this to this and we no longer have this left anymore? Is this a good idea? Hence the question mark. He got so into it, and it's fun to look at these paintings when you start to understand their use of symbology. You see these kind of lines up on this hill. I know it's difficult to make it out. These are lines that are being clear-cut by axemen working their way up the mountain. And if you turn the painting over, those are the Hebrew letters for God. And so what he's basically saying is the axemen work their way up and destroy all of the forest. They're wiping out God. God is no longer available to us if we turn all of this into this. It was a very popular painting, and people got it. The other neat thing that the Hudson River School artists were famous for doing is whenever you see trees that are burned out or blown over in some state of decay or disease, they're always oak trees. And the reason they're always oak trees is because it was a bit of a snubbing of the landed gentry system of England, because they used oak trees to mark the property boundaries of wealthy men's estates. And so you'll always see oak trees in some state of disrepair, and then you'll have the American elm tree being beautiful and vibrant. And so they had all kinds of little signs going on in their paintings that left little doubt about what they thought. This is a wonderful painting by Bierstadt, about 25 feet wide, so it's bigger than even what you're seeing here. Again, just absolutely celebrated as magical by Bierstadt, sold for $25,000, which was unheard of in the 1860s when it sold. Bierstadt would later suffer criticism as the century went on for being too imaginative. The critics were saying, you know, this guy just is painting more than what's really there. And Bierstadt and Moran and others said, well, of course we're painting more than what's there. We're not here as literalists. That's not our job as artists. Our job as artists are to emphasize those things that will call to your mind the essential aspects of your spiritual potential and your patriotic links to the culture as a whole. So they had no interest in being literal. This is a painting that Alfred Jacob Miller did, who did the Trapper's Bride painting earlier, and it's of a camp by a lord named Stuart who loved the Rockies. He kept leaving his Scottish castle and coming to the Rockies. He went to China, he went to Africa. He got bored to tears in every place but the Rockies, so he kept coming back. And this was one of his last journeys. That's Fort Laramie in the background. And at one point he was out on the plains of Chokecherry Creek in what's now North Dakota, and a guy who had been out wandering and hunting and just living the nomadic life named Friedrich Stuberg came along and topped a rise and looked down on Stuart's camp, and he couldn't believe it. He says these guys were wandering around with these feathered hats on, and they had, he went down in, they had manicured fingernails and Cuban cigars, and they were wearing slippers and velvet robes, and so these guys were running around the West for a couple months, just basically hunting and having the time of their lives, and then every night they would go into a tent, and they would have the scientists that Stuart hired to come along with them, just give them little debriefings about what they found during the day, and they would have cultural people come in and tell them what was what. So it was like a big wilderness salon for 2 months long. The Wyoming historians call this the first tourist trip to Wyoming ever. And there's some truth to it, but it didn't do anything to the only reason I've got it up here, it didn't do anything to disabuse that notion that going out to the wild places is something for the privileged and the elite, and somebody who's working all day really hard, ranching, farming, the last thing they're going to do is go out to the wilds and see any of this stuff. Not true at all. If you look at the visitor records from the 1870s through at least 1912 or 14 in Yellowstone, over half of the visitors were local ranchers and farmers coming from 100, 200, 300 miles away. They would sometimes in late summer load up their beans and their potatoes in the back of their wagon, throw the kids in, drive their farm wagons into the park. That's one of the reasons why there was such strong opposition in Yellowstone to cars, letting cars in, because the assistant superintendent in 1911 said, we can't, because all these farm animals that these locals have are going to spook in the presence of cars, and we're going to have accidents, we're going to have death, it's going to be a disaster. They had the time of their lives on these trips, and one of the things that especially the European visitors who were writing about what they saw in Yellowstone, they would make frequent mention of these sons and daughters of the soil, who one woman said, Cruikshank said, M.A. Cruikshank, they're certainly having a better time than any of us. At night they would the women would discover from other women who were doing the same thing that they could cook their dinner in the thermal features. So they would put their bags of beans or potatoes in a thermal feature, they'd go off sightseeing, they'd come back in an hour, and it was like a crock pot. It was fabulous. They had to do very little work. One of the dangers, and I got a kick out of seeing this in some of the diaries, is that some people weren't properly educated or informed, and they mistakenly put their dinner in geysers.
And so you'll read the line, dinner was lost, basically. The geyser went off and dinner was lost, you know, the beans all over the landscape. Margaret Andrews Allen discovered that she could do her laundry in a geyser, and she said it was fabulous, you know, the cleanest clothes she's ever had, she said. In fact, she said this was not a denigration of nature, it was an elevating to the level of poetics, the chore of doing laundry. So you started having these people really at the same time, you know, those guys were saying, oh, we've got to conquer all this stuff because it's dangerous and it's terrible. These sons and daughters of the soil are discovering the fact that, you know, there's a benevolent side to nature. And of course, when we're starting to get into the 1890s, then we see, as I hinted at earlier, a really strong backlash against what was happening in the industrial East. Not that industrialism wasn't seen as good and providing us with lots of wonderful things, but it was a hard, terrible life for a lot of people living in the inner city, and they started to dream of the Rocky Mountains and of nature as being benevolent. You have Roosevelt and his kind of companions still going, yeah, you got to go to nature because it strips off all the softening influences of civilization. You got to be tough and do all this stuff. But this is when you start to see Muir too, saying things like, you know, climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Cares will fall off like autumn leaves. That's the kind of notion that you see starting to happen a lot from the visitors coming from the East. They're no longer just the guys going out to hunt and be rough and ready, but they're also coming out because they desperately need a respite from the demands of the culture back east. It's Frederick Remington again. We have to have places like this to get past our vision of the world as a, you know, consisting of tasseled loafers, derby hats, and mortgages bearing 8%. So what basically happens is, I talked about those landscape artists having the audacity to take people, put wilderness basically in, sometimes without people, into their paintings. What happens through the 1800s, and this is the Lower Falls of the Yellowstone in 1872 by Thomas Moran, this was actually purchased for $10,000 by the U.S. Congress as the first landscape piece of art to go into the Capitol. And when you read about the reasons why these various politicians were voting for it, it wasn't just because, hey, it's a great painting and we got a new national park. It was, this will always remind us of, again, this promise of equality, the power of democracy, all that stuff that was held in symbol with wilderness came out again in their decision to buy this and hang it in the U.S. Capitol. But one of the things you'll notice is that there really are, if you look real hard, there's actually the artists on a point of land overlooking the falls. But what was going on is these artists continually started removing Anglos from the landscape. They kept native people in their paintings, but they started removing Anglos from the landscape. And I'm not so sure there isn't some of the root of how we see wilderness today in this. You know, the wilderness notion that it's a place where, you know, humans don't reside, but they're just visitors is essential and necessary today, but it's artificial. There has been no landscape in the Rockies or anywhere else on this continent that hasn't had some use for at least the last 10,000 years, if not longer. But what the artists were trying to get across is the notion that this was Eden before the fall, that through the abuses that they saw, especially in New England with the timber barons and later with the robber barons, with entire watersheds being wiped out, with game being wiped out, with rivers being polluted and fisheries lost, that we had basically taken the Eden that we were given when we got to this continent and pissed it away. And so by taking Anglos out, they were making, again, a political statement that may well, as I suggest, although I have no direct evidence, have informed some of how we came to see wilderness later on. Mount of the Holy Cross, I'm taking a lot of time here, so I'm just going to rip through this one. Here's another interesting example of the mystery and the essence of enchantment that people would lay onto the Rocky Mountains and other places in the United States. Mount of the Holy Cross was thought to be the equivalent of Lourdes as far as going there if you had some kind of an illness. As late as the 1930s, the Denver Post was writing about all the hundreds and hundreds of people who were massing for trips into the backcountry in the Colorado Rockies to go to the Mount of the Holy Cross, hoping and praying for some kind of miracle to happen to heal them. And then usually the article saying that's certainly what happened last year. You know, all these people got healed when they went. So it was a wonderful, wonderful thing. Eventually, and I don't know how to interpret this, the right arm of the cross, though, collapsed And it was a national monument for a while, and it was finally removed from the monument status because there really wasn't a cross there anymore, so I don't know how that got interpreted. But it wasn't just so much strictly Christian interpretation, it was just a holy place in nature where strange and wonderful things could happen. I mentioned that the black men had no small measure of success coming out away from slavery. How could you not be better off escaping slavery, but coming out to the West and how they were received as trappers? Well, they did the same thing when it came time to do cowboy work. In fact, there's some estimates that 25% of the guys who were trailing the cattle from Texas to Montana, the Goodnight Loving Trail and Lonesome Dove and all that, were black men. And they didn't often serve as trail boss, although sometimes they did, but they served in absolutely every other job there was concerning the trail drive. They were extremely capable horsemen. They were used to being horse experts in the South, and they brought that expertise out with them to the West, and they were a big, big part of the cowboy myth that only recently have they actually been acknowledged. And the thing I said earlier about women, I want to really spend just a little bit of time on the daughters of wealthy women coming out here. This was an era, and this is in the 1870s, and it's east of Colorado, 1880s, and these two women are on an antelope hunt. Now, the thought of a proper, well-educated, wealthy girl going on an antelope hunt was so far out of what was accepted. This was a time when people thought women would become sterile by overexerting themselves. There were all kinds of very weird Victorian mores that these women just basically turned their back on, at least when they came out west. They lived dual lives, a lot of them. It was interesting, if you were back in the East and you were a wealthy young woman and you were, let's imagine you were for progressive politics for women and suffrage and the right to vote and other radical things, you would spend most of your year living maybe in downtown New York City in a very posh circumstance, and then in the summer, because of the airborne diseases and lung problems and stink in the cities, you would go up to the Atlantic shore, you'd go into the Poconos, or you'd go someplace where these beautiful resorts had been established for the wealthy. And if you were a young single woman, you would be expected to be in your full petticoats and dress, and you might be allowed to play croquet if it wasn't too hot. But mostly what you're encouraged to do is not talk to any of the men, but sit on the porch and behave yourself and fan yourself. That was acceptable. In fact, there was something called, believe it or not, the language of the fans, where if you were a single woman and you wanted to convey to some good-looking guy who you were interested in but couldn't, God forbid, talk to him, you would fan yourself fast. And that would convey to him that you were single. And if you were married, you would supposed to fan yourself slow to let them know that, I'm not available. Or if you were dating someone at the time and you were betrothed, then you had all these crazy things. Well, these women come out west here, and especially to the dude ranches that started growing in the 1890s and really exploded in the early 1900s. The cowboys running the dude ranches in the West, they go, what? What are you kidding me? Put some jeans on, and here's a flannel shirt, and suddenly they were invited to go on cattle drives or branding, or they could help fix fence, or a lot of them got way into fly fishing, and they were so happy. They loved it. In fact, you started seeing on Madison Avenue stores cropping up that sold blue jeans and flannel shirts for these women who kept coming out west to get a break from the crap that was going on socially and political back east. By 1920s, New York Times was even saying, in addition to Paris and Antibes and these other places that a proper young girl should see, on her way to being educated, she must also spend at least 4 to 6 weeks at the Rocky Mountain Dude Ranch. And that wasn't just to kind of hone her mettle. That was about having the freedom and opportunity to speak her mind, to hang out with the men at the dinner table, all those things that really hadn't been accepted at all in proper society. Last slide. Hippies on the company store bench, Crested Butte, Colorado, 1972. Now this could look very much like hippies on the company store bench in Missoula, Montana at the same time, because Missoula was one of those places that in the late 60s started to see this influx, sometimes a major influx of people who, guess what, once again, just like the black sheep of the wealthy people, just like the women, just like a lot of the others who had come to the West and come to the natural settings because they didn't agree with what was going on in the mainstream culture, here they come again. The hippies and the Back to the Land movement were not anything new. They were an expression that had been going on and actually had been celebrated at various times in our nation's history. Now, how you were received when you went to these places depended a lot on the economy of the town. Over the hill from Crested Butte in Aspen was already successful enough that they didn't want any hippies showing up. And this is an interesting question about, as we become so gentrified in the West and everywhere else, where do you go if you're a freak? I mean, you're not going to get much of a reception anywhere anymore because nobody wants you hanging around lowering their property values. Aspen was freaked out when the freaks came. There was a police chief called Guido Meyer, and Guido had absolutely no use for the hippies. He had matchbooks printed out. He had to be the only guy in the country who did this, and the inside of the matchbook cover said no hippies. And the hippies, of course, would go in and steal them. And then he put a sign up on his cafe. He was a police chief, but he was a cafe owner. Said no beatniks allowed. And so what the hippies did at one point after he put that sign up, in true wonderful pacifist fashion, they had T-shirts screened that said "Eat at Guido's." And they went marching up and down in front of Guido's with signs and "Eat at Guido's" and "Peace and Love." And Guido freaked out. He absolutely went ballistic. And shortly thereafter, he was removed from his magistrate's position for showing substantial and enduring prejudice against his charges. So that was the end of that. But in Crested Butte, it had more of a shaky economy. It was an old mining town going off the deep end. The economy really was struggling. You could buy a breakfast special at Snell's for 79 cents. You could buy a house for under $10,000. And those old Slovian miners tended to be suspicious. They weren't necessarily happy with how these people looked, but they said, hey, this may be our future. So there was an interesting interweaving between the serious hippies, and there were those who were simply there to party. But there was a cadre here and there and everywhere else up and down the West and in the Appalachian hills of East Tennessee and other places where this played out. There were serious people who were looking for an alternative way. The roots of bioregionalism, which is such a common word now, really started from these Back to the Landers. So those who were serious forged alliances with these old timers. They had to know, geez, what can we grow at 9,000 feet in Crested Butte? Where do we get coal for our stove? They started tending the coal stoves of some of the elderly mining widows at night during the winter. And the Slovian miners liked it too. One of the things they liked especially is they'd go out at Nicholson Reservoir during the afternoon, and the hippies would be skinny dipping, and they would park their old trucks on the east side of the reservoir. And they thought that was grand entertainment, although their wives were very upset when they found out about that. But it was a serious effort on some of their part, and this is why the same year, really within a month of this photo being taken, there was a festival that was kind of made up between the old-timers and the new hippie people called the Flowshank Festival. It didn't really exist, but it was announced in the papers having these ancient Serbian roots, and it was a great celebration time. And so you saw Sally Crank, who was the mayor's wife, and the mayor was a hippie. This was a big thing, actually. The hippies took control of the city council and the mayorship. So you had Sally Crank, the hippie mayor's wife, and Pisker Sporsich, who was 72. He was the Flowshank king, she was the Flowshank queen, and they were riding down the main dirt street of Crested Butte in the convertible in the back seat and throwing little candies to the kids. And so it was a really interesting time in Crested Butte and in other places, and I think including Missoula. You know, not trying to turn it into a paradise because there were issues, but it was just a reliving and a restating of something that had been a mainstay of American behavior for a long, long time before. And I think with that, I'm going to wrap it up. One of the things I'm going to do is leave you with a question, if you care to comment on it. Sigmund Freud in the late 1920s, and Freud was no nature boy. He could have definitely been the poster child for I don't want to go outside. He just really saw little use for himself. He thought it was a powerful force, but he just was not interested. And he said, remarkably, because it was him saying it, in the 20s, that wild preserves, unkempt preserves, serve the same function in a culture that fantasy serves in an individual. And he basically said if you get rid of either one, neurosis will follow. So he wasn't, again, thinking you had to actually go there, God forbid. He was just saying that to know there are wild places out there is almost like a canvas onto which humans and cultures, entire cultures, can cast their imagination, imagining scary things and terrible things as well as beautiful things and glistening, wonderful, hopeful images. What I wonder about, if you have any thoughts on, is are we able, though, now, or are a lot of us able now, younger people coming up in such a technology-rich culture where immediate feedback and immediate gratification is demanded, are we even able to imagine the natural world the way that Freud envisioned it? Does it have the texture or dimension that it once did? And if it doesn't, what are we likely to perhaps lose by no longer being able to relate to nature in that more full-bodied way? I remember a few years ago, and I think I told this the other night, but a woman came up, and this happens all the time in Yellowstone, not to me because I'm not a ranger, but she was standing her little 5 or 6-year-old boy next to an elk in rut, and a big, massive bull elk, and I said, gee, you know, that's really not a good idea, and tried to be very nice about it, but she got extremely upset, and she said, you know, the Park Service wouldn't let these animals run around if they were dangerous. So, are we really so into virtual relationships with nature and other things that we're really kind of yanking the guts right out of what has long informed the way we think of ourselves and the way we think of the nation? So, with that troubling question, I will stop. And does anybody have any comments or questions they'd like to ask? Yes, sir.
I've got a comment about your picture.
Yes.
The hippies.
Yes.
The baby boomer generation.
Right.
Those people are back with $500,000 houses and trophy views. That's the generation that's doing it right now.
You are absolutely right. And what happened to allow so many of them to toss that ideal out the window and say, what the hell, you know, whoever has the most toys at the end is going to win, and I'm going to play that game too? What happened? How could that be?
Just borderline.
Well, that may be a little pessimistic, even for me. A piss poor lot. Well, that's. Does anybody have any other explanations for that or questions? But it is. You're exactly right. It's the same generation that is now trying to reduce beauty, which used to historically and through all time of nature, myth, and so forth, as an active, dynamic force that pulls you and nudges you as a person where you need to go on your path. Now beauty is reduced to, hey, I got this great house and a great picture window, and I can sit here with a gin and tonic, and I got all the beauty I need. So, you know, there's been a lot of diminishment again of the texture and the depth that we once gave to natural settings. Anyone else? Question? Yeah. One.
Well, I'm thinking about that problem with, like, say, the woman and her child by the rutting elk, and just wonder how much of this is connected to just a fundamentally different view of the outdoors. It's just sort of another place that we go to have a good time, another sort of form of recreation, instead of that symbology of freedom that they had, you know, with the hippies and misfits in the past. We have, and it's just something, just another thing that's come under this insurance mentality that we have in the world, you know, where people can say, sue McDonald's over the coffee being too hot, you know, sort of related to that.
Now, make your connection again between the tendency to see it as just, you know, yeah, place like another channel on the television or place for adventure and the McDonald's thing.
Well, it's one of these things where, yeah, if nature is just another form of recreation, just another way of, you know, having a little bit of fun, you know, it's another thing that we do, then it's no different from these other things where we expect, you know, if the playground, you know, if you fall off something on the playground, you can sue the city or whatnot. Yeah, and it's a similar thing to that, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that we want the illusion of risk, but we really don't want the risk. And that's an interesting point. I do think that makes sense to me. Yeah.
Well, isn't it really that the mirror image of the illusion of danger that the industrialists were trying to set up? And we've countered that so far that there's not only we've erased the illusion of danger, but we've created the illusion of safety.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, we clearly have created the illusion of safety. Absolutely. And the Park Service is sued constantly for people doing things that they didn't know would result in a bad end, like the guy who was jumping on the bison 2 summers ago to try to rodeo ride it and got gored and decided to sue, and for other lesser crimes too. But yeah, this just stunning notion. I think is William Borey still at University of Montana? Is that? Yeah. Is he? Okay, because I think he wrote about the Disneyfication of the natural world, that we expect it to be like a theme park, and that there are risk controllers out there that are going to keep us safe. Yeah.
I think parks have become more like watching TVs. People can now go through in cars and a whole motorized vehicle. They can go through it constantly and see it through little windows. And so as they drive, it's just like watching, dare I say PBS, if I'm not watching PBS, but they're just watching TV through their cars, and when they step out, they don't expect it to be real.
Yeah.
Dangerous to be real.
That makes sense. It's interesting, when I was writing the first of 2 wolf books, people wanted so much to see the wolves. There's something about that animal that just makes some people crazy. And they would actually get out of their car at 5:30 in the morning and sit in Lamar Valley for a couple hours. And none of them had ever done that. They were at first really fidgety and just like, where are they, where are they? We expected them to be like the Discovery Channel as soon as we got out of the car. But they wanted so much to see them that they sat there, and then, gosh, by the second or third day, they were so much different. They were starting to see how the light changed on the landscape, and the movement in and out of the woods at certain times of the day of birds and other kind of life. And so they got back, to some different level of relationship, but it had to happen only because they so wanted that. And I don't know if there are other ways that we could regain some of that. On one hand, I'm really happy that there's all these people jumping out of their minivans and running after bison with cameras, because it shows that at least the hunger for some connection and relationship is still there. But I'm not sure how we go back to putting it in a more healthy context again, or a richer context. Yeah. Yeah. That's you, sir.
That's one thing when you mention that. That's one thing I get out of the wilderness. Spent some time down in Wayne County with.
Oh, you're kidding me. Oh, one of my favorite people in the world.
Spend enough time with them and start to realize that when you spend time in the wilderness, enough time, it's not something outside of you that you're going to see. You get to start becoming that wilderness.
Well said.
And that's where, like, time down in Wayne County, I didn't start feeling like Wayne County was my place. I started feeling a part of a place.
Wow, nicely said. Were you working for Aspen, or? All right, we must talk.
But that's what wilderness is. To me, from experience, is getting to become a part of something greater than myself.
Yeah. That hunger for connection maybe is what people are doing when they run out of their minivans, but it's not solvable with that particular approach. But yeah, thanks. That's a good point. Yeah. Hey, how are you? You must have lots to say on this.
I have something to say that's been springing towards after that comment. I think what you said about wilderness not distinguishing our class and bloodline is a really interesting point. And the idea that this demographic that you described in the 19th century, these women from the Victorian era were drawn to wilderness for that reason, is an interesting thing to think about today when we consider that we are the wealthiest nation in the world. We are consuming more than anyone else, and really the only way to save this place that was once had this raw of being able to boil it down is to reduce that consumption. I don't know what I mean.
And how do you imagine, and I have my own notions, but how do you imagine the reducing of consumption to alter the status quo? Because that was written about actually in the late 1890s, that's one of the great advantages of going out in nature is you would know, again, what's really necessary in your life and what isn't. And I didn't know if that's what you were suggesting, or...
It is what I'm suggesting. I just think it's interesting to think about it in the context of today, and I guess my response to you, the more connected we are to wilderness and to the natural world, I'll call it the natural world.
Yeah.
The less we need to distinguish ourselves by our wealth or by...
So that could be a potential benefit of just living in a more conservationist mentality. It's not just sacrifice or giving up all this stuff. We're maybe gaining a perspective that we're actually, I think, deeply hungry for, but don't know how to fill. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Well, one alternative answer to the question about how the hippies got to be the baby boomers who were taking over the New West with their gin and tonics and large homes is 50 years of corporate advertising, which is creating a new mythology, which springs right off of the robber barons you were talking about, who created the mythology that they wanted to create. I mean, now we sit in front of the TV and watch ads for SUVs, and they're driving up every mountain and getting up on the tabletop plateaus and looking at the expanse of nature. And I find it hard to believe that we're going to be able to change that in everybody if we're being inundated by messages that brainwash us into thinking that no, this is our relationship with nature.
I think that's a great point, and nobody spends more money on psychological research than advertisers do, and they know how to get inside our heads, and it's naive to say that we haven't all been influenced by it. It's interesting, there was a discussion thread, if you will, through much of the 1800s, starting in around 1843-84. Some writers, fairly popular writers, were suggesting that by choosing a kind of political system and social system where we eliminated the class system, we left ourselves vulnerable to the only kind of class distinction that was left, and that was the accumulation of money. And so a lot of them warned that if capitalism either got untethered to a higher set of ethics or ideals, or wealth got too concentrated, that the nation would self-destruct. And so there was a lot of concern about that, although I don't hear such discussions necessarily in mainstream too much today. But great point. I think advertising is a huge, huge part of it. Yeah.
Another kind of advertising. I think that when people are out jumping out of their vans and taking photographs, in a way they are really becoming their own National Geographic photographer. Because if you look at a view, you go to Glacier, and there's that perfect 2-inch view, and there are 20,000 people behind you. The photograph never has those 20,000 ugly people. Pristine view in front of it. The melting glacier, for example, if you want to be that soft towards nature. So my question is, that comment, but following up, so what do you think about groups such as National Geographic helping package that mythology? And I can tell you that I have friends who work for National Geographic, and they have photographed roadkill, which has appeared on National Geographic documentaries. And they have been pushed to do it because the public expects an image of wildness. And they have to have that animal in some form or something.
And why are they pushed to do the roadkill?
No, they're pushed to have, they have to have the bison in the picture. If they don't find the bison by the end of the day, they'll resort to...
Oh, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. So you don't know that it's necessarily roadkill as the viewer. Oh,
no, but the public expects to see wilderness. Organizations, National Geographic and other organizations, package the mythology. It's sold back. The people up at Glacier Yellowstone are racing out with their cell phone cameras because they want to be the National Geographic photographer. They want to be able to edit, make their movie of life.
Yeah, and often missing it altogether because you're staring through the camera when something other remarkable thing is going on. But I think there is an absolute truth to that, almost kind of a second tier below the advertisers, is National Geographic, and I work with them in their book division, but their video division makes the claim that there is an absolute demand. There's a short attention span increasingly in our viewers, and so because of that, that's why we play into it. So everybody's just playing into something that they say they don't really have any control over, but they have to respect and they have to get in line with if they want to keep their advertisers on board and keep basically selling ad space on their stuff. And there's something in Yellowstone the rangers call animal ADD, and it's exactly that. You get out and you think it's going to be, a parade of predators go by, and when you have to stand there 10 minutes, you're off to West Yellowstone to the IMAX theater. You're not, you got 6 more parks to do in the next 4 days. You can't be spending a whole lot of time. So I do think that there is a consequence, and maybe none of those people or those forces are particularly or inherently negative in themselves, but when that's the only source that a lot of people get for their natural experience. It isn't just a summary, and they've already had that outdoor, more realistic view established on some other outing that they've done. It's, for so many of us, I think, the only way we understand nature, and so it probably has a terribly negative consequence. That's a good point. Yeah.
It seems like nowadays wilderness is packaged as an accessory for a lifestyle, and we brought that up in advertising and everything. So it sort of begs the question: is wilderness relevant to human life? And do you think that the problem with the current contemporary package of wilderness as sold by National Geographic, which I hate to mention, I don't want to point them out as doing something wrong. In fact, they may do a lot of good things. But is the problem, I lost my train of thought, is the problem asking the question, is wilderness relevant? And how is it relevant now? Instead, do you think that our problem is that it's not taught in school from an early age, that it's a system? Wilderness is actually a system of biodiversity that's necessary in a scientific sense, ecological sense, to the health of the planet, versus just pictures of pretty little fuzzy creatures?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent answer to your own question, is that it isn't quite as important as in early childhood as it used to be. The effect of rebellion against the robber barons in that general era in the 1890s with what happened in nature education in the early 1900s was phenomenal. It was a nature movement like the world has never seen. John Burroughs, a naturalist, was like Mick Jagger. He'd get off of a train station and there'd be hundreds of kids with "We Love You, John" signs, and there was a huge proliferation of school gardens so that kids living in the city could at least have touch, if not to wilderness, to the other, to some aspect of the earth that would, in theory anyway, lead them still back to a systems mentality. And I think that that's true. Maybe despite all our advances in environmental education and the wonderful programs out there, for a lot of kids, they don't have exposure to that. I think that if we can protect and preserve the wilderness areas, I would argue, yes, you've got ecological and scientific and just health reasons to do so, for the clean water and all the other things that go with that. But maybe when we're finally tired, if we're ever finally tired of distracting ourselves, and then covering up the discomfort we feel with Prozac and a lot of other things, maybe by having protected those open spaces, besides the benefit economically and health-wise to us, we'll once again have landscapes that will start to engender a sense of possibility and imaginative potential that doesn't seem to be going on right now. There's actually a report came out about 2 weeks ago of the national parks being very worried because it seems like the visitors of a certain age, I don't know, 16 to 21, have actually started really dropping off, and they think that the assessment was by these researchers that they're actually getting whatever nature they want from video sources and games and other things, that really they're starting to lose in a big way, again, direct experience of the world. So I think there's a lot of good economic and health reasons to save nature anyway. The other thing is, are we suffering consequences from having, as environmentalists, promised that, hey, the real reason to save these open spaces and these wonderful places is because people are going to want to live there. It's a lifestyle thing. I mean, have we as environmentalists played into that beginning in the 70s? That was a big argument, I remember, that potentially your property is going to be worth more if we have a national park or we have a national wilderness here. Everybody's want to come. They're going to spend money as tourists. They're going to do all this stuff. Have we become so unable to see the land as a part of something that informs our daily work lives, not just a place for adventure, not just a place for thrills, not just a place for, the quick shot on the camera, but something that actually is a part of a larger system, of a community. And boy, there's been very little accomplished in that. Maybe the bioregionalism movement is one small glimmer of hope. To start to see the wilderness is not just the only important thing, but all the foothills and the periphery of the wilderness where the communities exist as another important aspect, and on and on and on, until we start to see how these things are connected. Stop dissecting and start thinking in terms of systems. As you said, I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
We just have time for one more question, but I'd like to remind everyone that Gary will be signing books outside that door after we're done, and so if you want to find him to buy a book or to otherwise talk with him further, you'll find him out there. So,
Thank you, Lori.
I just have a comment on this whole mentality that we're talking about, and I think that many people, despite their avowed love of nature and going to these parks, that they actually have a fear of nature, and that this has increased in our century a great deal. You were talking about how the kids swarmed that guy before, and there's still kids. When I've done environmental education things, the kids still, they really love it. They just don't have that the connection growing up, even here in Montana more so, but not nearly, they're not as connected to the land. And people aren't as, in a family way, generationally connected to the land as they used to be. And I think that might be part of it as well. But the same people that jump out and take the pictures, I think oftentimes, actually, if they were to really go out and go backpacking, their heart would be pounding, they'd be afraid.
So they're being held at arm's length from that relationship because of fear. It isn't that we've lost the fear necessarily. Sometimes we've got an unrealistic amount of fear, is what you're saying, is that right?
And how to, so that if you want to feel like this guy over here feels, is talking about feeling that kind of feeling of being connected,
Yeah.
but that it's very hard to get there if you start out, like all the kids, many kids growing up in the city, and they're right, they don't have a connection to even what's a seed, what's anything, that's, what's this little animal look like? And so we need more of that kind of naturalist thing.
I agree, yeah. We need a renaissance in reaction to where we are now, much like they had in the early 20th century. I keep waiting and hoping that it's going to catch fire. I hope so. I mean, typically pendulums do swing, but then some other cheery historian told me a month or so ago that sometimes the pendulum falls off. So I hope we're not to that point. I shouldn't have ended on such a happy note, but thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.